Yo, what is up, guys? We are about to watch another interview with Gabor Maté, I think that's how you pronounce his name, by the channel of Dr. Rangan Chatterjee. I'm sorry for butchering your name. And the title of the video is, Does anyone else feel like everything has changed? Unhappy, lost, addicted, stressed? Let's check it out.
I wish I'd let myself be happier.
Yeah.
What does that say?
Well, that always reminds me of, because I mentioned Dr. Panksepp and his concept of the brain circuits.
Yeah.
One of them is for play and joyfulness. And do you know Winnie the Pooh?
Yeah.
Okay.
Not personally.
No, the book. And it's always
We're
been one
gonna
of my
fast
favorite
forward
books.
1.25x.
And I've talked about this before. The end of that book would bring tears to my eyes for years, because how it ends is Christopher Robin. By the way, that's a whole other thing. The relationship between A.A. Milne and his son Christopher was a very fraught and difficult one.
Right.
And Christopher actually resented the books because he felt that his father was buying these toys to write about rather than for his own benefit.
Wow.
Well, they had a very different. There's a photograph of the two of them, and the kid is looking so alienated. He had a tough life, but that's a whole other story. But the book in the book,
I never
Christopher
knew
Robin,
that.
the little boy now has to go to school,
Yeah.
and he has to learn about history and factors and mathematics and so on. And he's telling his friends, the toy animals, that he won't be able to play with them so much anymore. And in the end, Christopher and Winnie the bear of Little Brain, who's the smartest of the whole lot, and they walk off together. And the book ends with the statement, something like, and whatever they do, wherever they go in the enchanted forest, the little boy and his bear will always be playing together. And that phrase would bring tears to my eyes for years. Because play is so important and joy is so important. And that's what these people are talking about. And they didn't allow themselves to experience it. They sacrificed the play and the joy for all these other things. And so the good thing is, I mean, in my marriage, the best thing, and you know what the best thing in my marriage is? The way we play together. The first time I dated my wife, Ray, I knocked on the parents' door and I said, can Ray come out and play? And we've been doing it ever since. And so I believe what's being described in that last regret is people sacrifice their playfulness, their joyfulness for the sake of being accepted and being successful and all that. It's a huge one. Play is built into our brains. Kids play spontaneously, infants play. And in that sense, we can all be Winnie the Pooh and Christopher. We can always keep playing in the enchanted forest. And that's just essential, I think.
In that final regret is the word happier.
Yeah.
What does happiness mean to you?
Really, it means the capacity to play and to be in the present moment. And the kids, when kids play, they don't worry about the appropriately. They don't worry about the war wherever or climate change. They're just playing in the moment. They're fully present to themselves in imaginative, almost hypnotically imaginative states. So happiness just means being in the present and being allowed to be, no matter what, to have the capacity to play.
A lot of people today, Gabor, and I think you have struggled with this as well, from what I know, feel with so much heartache and suffering in the world, they feel that they have no right to be happy. What's your take on that?
Well, first of all, Bob Dylan said somewhere that it's difficult to be completely happy when other people are suffering. And it's true. So this is a time of terrible suffering. You know how I feel about Gaza and the terrible things that are happening there. How can I be completely happy? I can't be completely happy. I can't, because I can't not think about that. The horror of it. But at the same time, and this is why people might start get weirded out.
By the way, if you don't know what's happening currently, Trump has said he's gonna take over Gaza and make it part of the US and make some sort of a riviera or something it's called, ravine. So basically he's gonna modernize it and make it some part of a, I don't really know how it's called. Anyways, they're gonna take it over and send all the people, all the Palestinian people, to other countries like Egypt. What is gonna happen there now? That is gonna be so interesting. Is this the start of World War III? Imagine. No, but really, that's gonna be crazy. How is Iran gonna react to this? I don't want to get political, but I do know my way around what is going on there. So yeah, let me know in the comments, but don't be too political about it. But that is the time we are currently living in, and he said it yesterday. So there's a lot of speculation going on right now. I find it very interesting.
But I'm talking about a psychedelic experience. This is 3 or 4 years ago. I worked with psychedelics both as a healer but also as a subject, and I was having a mushroom experience. And the same thing would happen with ayahuasca once. And I've always been one that felt that how could I be happy when Auschwitz is possible? When Auschwitz happened, when my grandparents perished there, how can I be happy? What do I have to be happy? If that can happen in the world, and that did happen in the world. And both the plants showed me at some point that happened, and yes, you can be happy. That the one doesn't detract from the other. That the capacity to be empathetic and to recognize the grief and to hold the grief does not obviate the capacity to be happy. And one is not disloyal to the suffering in the world by allowing myself to be happy. So there's no necessary contradiction. And I've seen people on death row who, if they win their appeal, the best thing they can hope for is life in jail without life in prison without parole, but they're happy. And how do they become happy? Meditation, working through their traumas, having remorse for what they did, connecting with other people, and just connecting with the present moment. And I'm thinking, my God, if people in that situation can be genuinely happy, which I've seen, I've had contact with the people, then who am I to say that I can't be happy? So ultimately there's no contradiction. Now in this society, there's way too much emphasis on, don't worry, be happy. Let's ignore all the bad stuff that's going on. Let's just concentrate on how we can make ourselves pleased or pleasured or whatever. I'm not talking about that.
No.
I'm talking about being able to hold both at the same time.
Yeah, you have to. And this is something I feel I've really grown into over the last few years, that I actually can be very happy and content. Whilst there is heartache in the world, it doesn't mean I don't care. I actually deeply care. But I've realized that it's a real skill. It's an evolution of the self to be able to hold those two. I really do think that. I think it's growth.
That's right.
I very much love the phrase that's attributed to Gandhi, be the change you want to see in the world. I know. I try my best to live my life by that. And why that's relevant to this part of the conversation is, I said this once at a live event. I said, listen, if you watch the news and this is a few years ago, allow the heartache that's going on in, name the country, right, to affect you so much so that you develop apathy, you can't interact with your husband, with your children, you just drink more and more alcohol in the evening to numb your pain. What does that do? Right? You're no good to the people who are suffering. You're no good to those people around you. And that then ripples to everyone around you. Whereas if you can learn to be content where you're at, if you then do want to go and help in whatever way, you're much more able to, volunteer, send money, whatever it might be. So I think this is a really important point for people, especially the way things are in the world at the moment. A lot of people feel I've got no right to be happy.
Well, I no longer believe. I used to believe that. And somebody once said to me, don't be so loyal to your suffering. And that's a lesson I've had to learn fairly late in life. And as I quote in The Myth of Normal, my friend Bessel van der Kolk, the trauma psychiatrist, looked at me once, this is about 10, 12 years ago, we were having lunch, and he said, Gabor, you don't have to drag Auschwitz around everywhere you go. And what he meant by that is that you don't have to let that affect your present moment, that you can be aware of it, hold the memory of it, but not let it determine your internal states, and it's true. And I understood intellectually at that time what he meant, but it was only later that I was actually able to emotionally let go.
Let's just talk about forgiveness then.
I knew that he was Jewish, but I didn't know that his folk got Auschwitz, because then he had to be here in Germany, right? Or Poland. And I feel sorry for him. From my family side, they also got Auschwitz, because I'm Gypsy, but I don't have any connection to them, and it's all just stories that I hear, and I would like to know more, but I probably never will. But I never thought about it throughout all of my life, being loyal to my pain it never fazed me, right? Having like positive feelings and being happy and stuff while other people are suffering, as he said, is a really skill to hold on to both of them. Just the knowledge about it. And honestly, if I think about it, it's just something you have to phase out. You have to like forget about to be happy. But it will always come back because it never will not leave. Because it's the reality. It's just, what are you gonna do? Can't do anything about it. I just wish I would have known more, or my parents taught me more about it, or family in general. But they never did. It's like something that happened, they mention it, and then like, yeah, it was bad. And that's it. I think I said it once, like, in my family it's like this, like, when you ask something, the answer you get, at least for me it's always because. That's how I grew up.
Then, because a lot of the time people say, I just can't forgive. What happened to me was wrong. Now, I accept what happened to someone can be wrong, but it doesn't necessarily follow that you can't forgive. What's your take on forgiveness?
Well, you and I last night were talking about a woman that we both met and admired tremendously, Edith Egger. And Edith, as I told you, was 16 years old when I was 1 year old. She lived in a town in what is now southern Slovakia, then was northern Hungary, called Kasia or Košice, and her family were taken to Auschwitz. And my grandparents would have been either on the same shipment to Auschwitz or within the next day or so. And her parents perished, and she survived with her sister. And she's become a psychotherapist. She's written a couple of wonderful books that I know you've met her and interviewed her. And in one of her books, she describes going to the Berghof in Bavarian Alps, where Hitler used to have his lair, and she went there to forgive Hitler. And it doesn't mean that it was okay what he did. She did that to liberate herself. She said, I don't want to keep him in this prison in my heart for the rest of my life. I've worked too hard to attain happiness and joy, to let this tension and this constriction control me. So the forgiveness wasn't making okay or pardoning Hitler for all the evil that he perpetrated in the world, but is her letting go.
He let go.
She let go. The emotions around it and of the tension and the tightness around it. So forgiveness is not for the other person. It's for yourself. Now, when I work with forgiveness, I don't advise people to forgive. If, as a matter of fact, I do the opposite. I say to people, before you forgive, allow yourself to feel the full anger that's in you. Let yourself fully experience the anger that's there. Because once you do, it'll dissipate. You'll let go of it. So don't do it in order to forgive. Do it in order to liberate yourself. Now, let's say I was abused as a child. But let's say I find myself a fully liberated, present-oriented, in contact with myself, human being. Then what does that mean? It means nothing was taken away from me. It means that whatever happened caused me a lot of pain over the years, but it didn't limit my capacity. I wasn't robbed of anything. So what's there to forgive? So, and you can also ask yourself, or anybody, when you haven't forgiven, what's in your heart? What's in your body? Do you like that state that you're in? The tension. Do you like that? Is that how you want to be? Do you think that's really helping you? So I don't go out of my way to teach. Now, I know that in a lot of spiritual practices, there are forgiveness practices, and I know in Buddhist practice and a lot of spiritual practices, there are forgiveness meditations and prayers. My mind doesn't go there. But my mind does say, I always have to experience all the rage, all the hatred, all the anger that's in you, and be with it and see what happens to it. And what happens to it, once you pay attention to it, it actually dissipates. And so when Edith goes to the Berghof to forgive Hitler, she's just saying, I don't want to hold on to this stuff anymore. It's not okay what you did, but I don't want to hold on to this stuff anymore.
Yeah. It's fascinating. I think curiosity is often a very helpful pathway to forgiveness. Because if you get curious about that other person, as to why did they act that way? You know, I'm not talking about Hitler here. I'm talking about anyone.
But even with Hitler.
Yeah. What were the conditions in that person's life that led to that? If I was that person, I'd be behaving in exactly the same way because I would have had their parents and their childhood experiences and their bullying, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly.
Once you look at the world through that lens, your initial approach becomes compassion. Forgiveness comes as a side effect of getting curious.
That's totally right. And there's an expression that you may be familiar with. It goes, to understand is to forgive.
Yeah.
And it begins with curiosity.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
And I think that curiosity is the essential quality that actually leads to compassion in the end. Now, compassion doesn't mean tolerance of bad behavior.
No.
It doesn't mean validating or justifying crimes against nature or crimes against other human beings. But it takes away that quality of tension where you make yourself superior to reality, and you put yourself in a position to judge reality. You know, and I'm above it, and I'm in a position to judge.
Yeah.
That's not a comfortable. I mean, actually, it is comfortable for a lot of people to be there, but it's a way of not dealing with their own stuff. So I do think that curiosity is the key.
Just to wrap this conversation up, Gabor, we've been talking a lot about these regrets, the regrets of the dying.
Yeah.
And the final question I want to put to you is about the word regret. I have been playing with the idea over the last 12 months or so that regret is actually a form of perfectionism. So I actually now very much subscribe to the philosophy of no regrets, but not in the kind of derogatory way. You know, I'm going to live my life my way. It doesn't matter who comes to my way. No, with this really compassionate understanding that I've always done the best that I can based upon where I was in life at that time. So even the things that I look back on and go, actually, you know what? If I was in that situation again today, I would act differently. I don't see them as regrets. I see them as situations that happen that have taught me something, which is allowing me to be a better version of myself today.
Exactly.
Not even 10 minutes in and I'm already crying. Very triggering topics. And they are so right. It's a little too much calling it perfectionism, but I understand where he's going with it.
So in my life today, there is no room for regret anymore. And I guess I would love to know, you know, right at the end here, what's your perspective on the word regret?
I think chronic regret is debilitating. It's a lack of self-forgiveness.
Yes.
It's also kind of egotism of that somehow I'm that important. It's quite something to recognize. I do recognize that some of the way I parented my kids, the way I showed up, I've often talked about this on your program too, wasn't the best for them, but it was the best.
What about the people you hurt intentionally?
So it's not the question of justifying anything, but it's also not dwelling on the past. Regret is to dwell on the past.
People who love
What's
you.
the point? It's quite something to recognize that I did things that, had I known differently, I would not have done the same way. That's just learning. Regret is an emotional state that values the past more than the present, and it accuses yourself of doing things for which you had no consciousness to do otherwise. So that's where I stand with regret.
Yeah. Gabor, you know what a big fan I am of your work. It's just incredible to see the impact you're having on so many people around the world. I'm very lucky to consider you a friend these days.
Likewise.
It's been great to get to know you over the last few years. For someone who has heard us speak today, and something connected with them, something you said spoke to them and they thought, wow, yeah, you know what? I'm carrying around old stuff with me today. I don't express my emotions. I'm not living a life that is true to me.
Yeah.
What are some of your final words for them?
Well, it's the word that you used, curiosity. So not why am I living this way, but why am I living this way? You know, what happened to me? What am I carrying here? So the key phrase is precisely the one that you introduced, the necessity to be curious.
Yeah.
In a compassionate way. So you don't do an interrogation of yourself like you're a prosecuting detective. Why did you or why did you not? But compassionately, why did you not?
Yeah.
Why did you? And if you ask these questions compassionately and with curiosity, the answers will emerge, as will the capacity for you to make different choices as you move forward. So where there wasn't choice before because you were compelled or driven, now you can have some freedom if you're willing to be curious.
All behaviors of addiction, substance dependent or not, whether gambling, sex, the internet, or cocaine, all of them either soothe pain directly or distract from it. Hence your mantra, the first question is not why the addiction, but why the pain. And I think that beautifully sums it up. You know, in that you're likening addiction to drugs, potentially to
what is this?
Sex, gambling, alcohol, maybe shopping.
Well, so I've had my own shopping addiction, and I can tell you that
cut the video like this?
What happens in my brain when I'm indulged in my shopping addiction is exactly the same that happens in the brain of the cocaine addict. In other words, there's an excitation of the reward, incentive, and motivation circuitry. And what the addict is after is that temporary change in brain status. Really what it is, all addictions are an attempt to regulate an unbearable emotional state internally. But you're trying to regulate your internal state through external means. And that's what an addiction is. So temporarily you get a change in the state of your brain, in a change of your physiology. You can do that through drugs. You can also do it through gambling or internet or sex or shopping. But essentially after that same revitalization of your incentive and motivation circuitry of your brain. And so from my perspective, there's only one universal addiction process that dominates all addicted people. The targets of addiction may be different. The internal effects are much the same.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I should add, when you look at the sources of it, the states that people are trying to escape are states of emotional distress, states of emotional pain, and hence why the addiction, not why the addiction, but why the pain.
So some people who are listening to this or watching this right now might be thinking, yeah, I get that. That all sounds fine for those people who are addicted. But I, of course, am not addicted to anything. So you've got a rather beautiful definition, I think, of addiction, which I think will be really helpful to sort of go through at the start here so that people listening can actually figure out if it does relate to them or not.
Well, when I speak to a room of people and I ask them how many are addicted, most people will only think of drugs. So some people put their hand up. Then I give them my broader definition of addiction, and not everybody puts their hand up. And that definition is that an addiction is manifested in any behavior that a person finds temporary pleasure or relief in and therefore craves, but suffers negative consequences in the long term and is going to be able to give it up. So any behavior, not just drugs. The key hallmarks are craving, pleasure, relief in the short term, negative outcomes in the long term, inability to give it up. That's what an addiction is. And that could be to drugs, nicotine, caffeine, alcohol, the lethal and legal substances, or it could be to heroin, cocaine, crystal meth, fentanyl, cannabis, any number of other substances. But it could also be to sex, to gambling, to shopping, to eating, to work, to exercise, to the internet, to gaming, to pornography, to political power, to the acquisition of wealth, to the hoarding of objects, anything. And when you give that definition, and you ask people how many here would acknowledge some addiction in their life, sometimes the vast majority of people would put their hands up, which means to say that addictions are on a continuum, it's on a spectrum, and they're distributed, dispersed throughout all of our society. And so that the identified drug addicts make up only a small, narrow segment of our addicted population.
So really the whole way we think about addiction, the way we criminalize various forms of addiction really needs to change to a more compassionate way of dealing with it, but also really trying to understand what's the root cause. Because if, you know, I totally subscribe to your theories, and I think that ultimately, if the root cause of all addiction or all addictive behavior is the same, how do we tackle that? And where does that come from? What is that root cause?
So once you're asking not why the addiction, but why the pain, now you have to forget that it's a choice because nobody chooses to be in pain. And you also have to forget the medical idea that it's an inherited brain disease. You actually have to look at people's lives. Now, in Vancouver's downtown east side in Canada, where I worked for 12 years, with a highly addicted population, these people had multiple addictions: cocaine, alcohol, cannabis, opiates of all kinds, cigarettes in every case. They suffered with HIV, with hepatitis C. They would die of overdoses, suicide, infections of all kinds. And these people, every single one of them had been heavily traumatized in childhood. All the women I worked with over 12 years had been sexually abused. All the men had been neglected or beaten or emotionally abused. I'm talking about now the severely addicted population, which is also what the large-scale study shows, that the greater the childhood adversity,
the greater risk for addiction in adulthood. Now, the more severe the childhood adversity, the greater the risk of substance addiction and injection use. However, if you look at my own case, I wasn't beaten, I wasn't abused in my family of origin, I wasn't neglected, but I was a Jewish infant born during the war in Hungary, and spent my first year under the Nazi regime. You can imagine under what circumstances. So I had a very unhappy, stressed, terrorized mother. And children can be hurt in two ways. Children can be hurt when bad things happen to them that shouldn't happen. That's the abuse, that's the violence in the family, that's the parental addiction. But children can also be hurt when their needs are not met. Now, I had this need for an attuned, empathetic, emotionally responsive mother. She couldn't be that. Not because she didn't love me, not because she didn't do her best, but simply she was too terrorized, she was too depressed. The lack of that joyful, attuned, loving mother who, I shouldn't say loving because she loved me tremendously, but her love couldn't be translated into responsive behavior. That alone was enough to hurt me. So, in other words, the source of addiction is always some kind of a childhood hurt, either because bad things happened that shouldn't have, or because the good things that should have happened couldn't happen because of the parents' emotional states. Both of these are enough to hurt the child in a way to driving them to self-soothe through addictions.
So do you think your own experience of trauma, really, as a young baby, not even a child, as a young baby, has impacted your own health, your own behaviors, and therefore ultimately where you are today, which is one of the world's leading voices on trauma and addiction? Do you think that has been instrumental in you getting to where you are today?
Having to deal with the impacts of that has been instrumental. I mean, I really, as an adult, I was a successful physician. You know, I was much in demand, family practitioner. I was head of a palliative care department at a major hospital. I was a national medical columnist for a Canadian newspaper in my 50s. And internally, I was driven, workaholic, depressed, affected by ADHD, anxious, and unfulfilled and unsatisfied. And it's when looking at those dynamics and wondering, well, what the heck has happened to me here, and what is the gap between my external persona and my internal experience of myself, that's when I began to deal with trauma. Not to mention, as a family physician, and you and I were talking about this before, we get to see patients before they get sick. The specialists only see them after the illness has been diagnosed. I get to see people before they get ill. I get to see people in their context of their multi-generational family background. So we have a much broader view of who gets sick and why. And so both through my medical work and having to deal with my own stuff, I began to realize the central role of trauma in shaping people's health or illness.
Yeah, since I've been studying trauma myself, both with the work that you do, but just other things that I'm reading around it, it really helps me understand my patients and their behavior is much better. I really you can start to tap in now as to what they're coming in with more. You think, oh, that's what's going on behind that, not the symptom they're describing, but why are they making those choices? And some of you may not know, Gabor, I a few years ago, I did a series of documentaries on BBC One called Doctor in the House. And what I would do on that is I went to live alongside families who had health problems. They were already under GPs, they were already under specialists, they were all taking medication pretty much already, and they still weren't getting better, and they were still struggling. So I went in to, sometimes I'd stay the night in their houses, I'd live alongside them, really get to understand, you know, what choices they were making with their lifestyle, sure, but also I'd get to see, you know, various dynamics in the family, the sort of thing that would never come up in the consultation room. Even if you ask that question, they would never even think to bring those things up. But you would just start to spot things and little dynamics. And I found that with every single family, pretty much now, if I reflect back on all those families I stayed alongside, I was very fortunate to get really good health outcomes with them all after about 6 weeks. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying this video and want to learn more, you can download my free special guide containing 6 simple breathing practices that will help you calm your mind, lower stress, and improve your energy. To get hold of this guide, all you have to do is click on the link in the description box below.
But like an app,
but there's a huge emotional component behind
not
all
really
of the
using it,
illness.
but
Now, just to be clear, I'm not saying that it was in their head at all. They had proper physical symptoms that they were struggling with. And obviously that in some ways can make people feel down a little bit about themselves because they're not feeling so good. But I really got the strong sense that when you start to look at their lives and their upbringing and how they saw themselves, it was uncanny how many times their emotional health was absolutely tied into their physical health.
Well, so one of the books I've written, which will be published in Britain in a few months, is entitled When the Body Says No, The Cost of Hidden Stress. And I'm making the case, precisely as I heard you articulate just now, is that when it comes to chronic illness, and whether it's colitis or Crohn's disease, multiple sclerosis, ALS, or motor neuron disease in England, malignancy, chronic psoriasis, eczema, chronic fatigue syndrome, the physiological symptoms, which are not in people's heads in the sense that they're imagining them, but it very much originates in people's heads in that it has a lot to do with certain relational and emotional patterns that they adopted in childhood. In other words, what I'm saying is that because of childhood programming, people impose certain unconscious stresses on themselves, and those stresses, because of the unity of mind and body, which unfortunately is not taught or recognized in the medical schools, but which scientifically is not even vaguely controversial, because the immune system and the emotional apparatus and the hormonal apparatus and the nervous system are part and parcel of the same system. So when something occurs emotionally, which it does on a chronic basis, that has an impact of undermining people's physiology, turning their immune system against themselves or suppressing the immune system. So I absolutely agree that people's emotional patterns, which reflect not individual choices or mistakes, but multi-generational patterns in the family, those emotional patterns translate into physical illness. And if we can address those emotional dynamics, we can actually have an impact on the physiological course of their illness, which is, again, not something that anybody in medical school will ever tell you, because there's this unfortunate separation of mind and body that you and I are trained in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the key things there for me was that you're not putting blame on people.
There's no blame.
Yeah, and I think that's really, really a key point that maybe we can discuss now, because a lot of people may be hearing that feeling, maybe I've done this to myself, or my mother did this to me, for example, and that's not what you're saying at all, is it?
Well, this is an interesting conversation. I make the distinction between blame and responsibility. Okay. Blame says that you did something that you could have done otherwise, and so therefore you're at fault. That's what blame says. Responsibility says, yes, you did this to yourself, but not consciously or deliberately. You did it because you're programmed to do it by your own childhood experience, which in turn was programmed by your parents' childhood experience. So there's nobody at fault. Everybody does their best, but we do pass these unconscious patterns on. And you don't blame people for having unconscious patterns. You try to make them conscious of it so they can take responsibility for it. So there's no responsibility without consciousness. Yeah. And so, and there's no blame. So I don't blame anybody for their illness. I don't blame their parents either. But I do say these unconscious patterns have been passed on, and these unconscious emotional dynamics have an impact on your physiology. That's all. And if you want to have an impact on your physiology, you got to get conscious. You have to realize what have you been doing unconsciously so you can stop doing it or do it differently. So it's a matter of liberating people from these ingrained patterns for which they're not to be blamed. So in my world, there's no room for blame whatsoever, but there is room for helping people to become responsible, for helping people being response-able, being able to respond to their circumstances. And without awareness, none of us are response-able.
Yeah, I think if I think to my own life and my own health journey over the last few years, and I guess what's really changed for me over the last few years, I've done a lot with my lifestyle, I've done a lot with my nutrition, my sleep, and those things have been great and they've really helped me. But over the last few years, I've really been focused on my emotional health. I see a therapist pretty regularly, and I can always feel when I've got something new, some deeper layer that's starting to come out. I have a session, or I go through some sort of therapy, and I feel good. I feel, oh yeah, I've got it now. I get it why I do this, and it changes your behavior certainly. But it's almost as you do that, there's multiple layers. It's like peeling back a layer of the, it's peeling back layers of the onion, and newer things keep coming out, which has been really rewarding for me, because you talk about addiction, and I think back to my own life and various things that I've done at certain points. I don't think anyone who knows me well, maybe my close friends, but most people probably wouldn't think that I've ever had an addiction, because we have all these connotations about addiction. It's like being on a street corner or being a drug addict or something. Yeah. But everyone around me would know that I've got an addictive personality. Yeah. And I used to think that was my personality. That's the way I was born. What's weird, that as I start to process my own emotional baggage and I start to clear it, I'm no longer as an addictive person as I used to be. And that's why I kind of feel so strongly about the work that you're doing, because I kind of feel that wasn't my personality. That was the behavior I had chosen to soothe something that I was missing.
Well, so how would I put it? I mean, I agree with your concept. I would use a different language around it.
Sure.
That was your personality, but it wasn't your person. It wasn't who you were. The personality itself is a defensive structure that we develop as a way of dealing with our pain. So much of what we consider to be a personality is actually an overlay upon our true selves. And so these are in choices in childhood. For example, with my ADD, the tuning out. I never chose to tune out, but when I was an infant under the conditions that I described, of being a Jewish infant under the Nazis, I had plenty of stress on me. And how does an infant deal with stress that they can't change? They tune out. And then the tuning out becomes programmed into my brain. And then so many years later, I'm diagnosed with ADD. It wasn't a choice that I made, it was an adaptation. So what I would say about the personality, including what you described as your addictive personality, it wasn't you, it was an adaptation that you took on as a way of surviving your childhood, as a way of soothing your pain. It's when we get older that we realize that there's something more to us than a personality, that the personality is actually a defensive cover for who we truly are. And as we start, like as you describe your own process, you go through therapy and you go through layers, and then you realize, oh, that's not actually me.
Yeah.
And I'm freer without it. Then you realize that what we thought was the personality was actually just a defensive cover. And once we strip that defense off and we find it no longer necessary, we become much more true to ourselves, much more true to ourselves, so become much more balanced and happier in our lives. So yes, it was the personality, but you are not your personality. That's how I would formulate it.
Yeah, no, I love the way you put that, actually. It really, really helps me think about it in a slightly different way. I think something came into my mind there, which is, and we were chatting a little bit about this before we got on air, about medicine and how reductionist it has become, the practice of medicine. And I think something like high blood pressure, for example, I think of as an appropriate response from the body to the signals that it's been given.
Absolutely.
And I think there's an analogy there with what you're saying, which is if you're surrounded by stress as a young baby, whatever that stress is, your brain is going to adapt to that. It's an appropriate response to the signals that your brain is getting. Is that fair to say?
That's right. So my next book is going to be entitled The Myth of Normal, Illness and Health in an Insane Culture. And when I say insane culture, I mean a culture that doesn't meet human needs. So if you take a condition like high blood pressure, what's the medical term for high blood pressure?
Hypertension.
Hypertension. Okay. And doctors, of course, our colleagues say, well, there's a few types of hypertension for which there's a cause, like kidney disease or some kind of hormonal disorder. But for most part, we don't know what causes high blood pressure.
Essential hypertension.
Essential. We call it essential, which basically we don't know what the heck we're talking about. That's what that means. Just take the word hypertension and slow it down a bit. Hypertension, hypertension, hypertension. Maybe there's too much tension in people's lives, And if you actually look at the rising rates of hypertension, it's got to do with social pressure and social stresses. And I know that usually when I take care of myself, I have the blood pressure of a young person. But there's been times in my lives when I've been driven by stress, and I've had the blood pressure ranges in the risky end of the scale. So for me, when my blood pressure goes up, it's a real warning. Buddy, you've got too much tension in your lives. You better do something about it. All we do in medicine is we hand out pills, or we tell people to lose weight, but we never address the sources of real tension in their lives. And I'd say that most hypertension, and so for example, if you look at black American males, they have much higher risk of hypertension than, say, white American males. What we say is genetic. No, it isn't. Their biological relatives in Africa do not have high blood pressure.
Right.
So it's an artifact of being a black male in essentially a racist society. And James Baldwin, the American writer, once said that being a black American male is to live in a condition of suppressed rage all the time.
Yeah.
Well, that suppressed rage will drive your blood pressure. So hypertension.
And drive other ill health.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So high blood pressure is a great example of a socially induced physiological condition, which is mediated through our emotions and the impact of our emotions on our autonomic nervous system and on our hormones.
Yeah, it's, I've never really thought about the term hypertension like that before, hypertension, and it makes such sense when we think about it like that. You mentioned this new book you're writing, talking about how we've got is it an insane society around us?
Yeah.
And I think of stress. As I mentioned to you, I've just spent a few months locked away writing a new book on stress called The Stress Solution. Yeah. And I feel strongly that when we talk about making changes, so a lot of people, when they try and improve their health, they try and improve their lifestyle, okay, which is a pretty reasonable start. Mm-hmm. But many people, I find, can't do that, or they do it temporarily for a few weeks, a few days, a few months maybe, but then they revert back. And as a doctor, I've always been intrigued as to why do some patients keep coming back? And why do some patients with the same so-called problem get better with the same course of treatment?
Right.
And I always think, well, if they keep coming back, I'm clearly not getting to the root cause of the problem. And the more I think about your work, although people talk about you in the realm of addiction and trauma, I think your work doesn't only explain addiction and trauma, it explains all human behavior, and therefore has profound implications, not only for trauma, not only for pain, not only for addiction, but actually the whole of the health landscape.
Well, thank you. And again, in my various books I've written about that, it just so happens that it's my addiction book that's being published right now, first in England. When you get down to it, it's very simple. Either you raise human beings whose needs are met, or you raise human beings in a way that you don't meet their needs. When you don't meet people's needs, they have to adapt in artificial ways. those adaptations become a source of illness later on. There was a very interesting article in the journal Pediatrics, which is the official journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics, published in January 2012. There was an article on childhood development generated by the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, so as prestigious as you get. And the inner abstract, they say that human environments that, because of scarcity or stress, trouble young children, cause these children to make adaptations which are psychological and physiological adjustments that are necessary for immediate survival and adaptation, but which may come at a long-term cost to health, behavior, and longevity. In other words, the way that young children adapt to stress early on helps them survive that early stress, but in the long term, those same adaptations become sources of pathology. So if you look at my own tuning out, so the tuning out that I did as an infant under conditions of severe psychological strain is an adaptation. It helped me as an infant survive a year where the situation was utterly impossible. But that same tuning out gets programmed into my brain, and now I'm diagnosed with a medical condition, ADHD, decades later. So what was adaptive in one circumstance becomes maladaptive later on. I'm suggesting that much of illness begins with that these are necessary personally adaptations, however, which then stress us later on. And so that is a real, so what's common to my work is that I look at the sources of adult function or dysfunction in our formative experiences. And, you know, that's not controversial if you look at a gardener. I mean, if a gardener looks at their plants, they know that how they treat that young plant will have a huge impact on the adult plant. Anybody who is in animal husbandry will realize that how you treat the young, whether it's a dog or a horse, will have a huge impact on the personality and behavior of that animal later on. Why don't we get the same thing in human beings? It's the same principle. So it's essentially very simple.
Yeah, it really is, isn't it? When you break it down to the like that, it's super simple. We need a society that really supports children and babies and mothers and parents at a young age.
Absolutely.
And then I guess what comes to my mind is, and you may know the stats on this, I don't, but we here in the UK, we always are talking about Scandinavia, and we talk about how they are really prioritizing those early years. You know, they give a lot of maternity leave, a lot of paternity leave. You know, yes, they may have high taxes, but it seems to me that their society there has prioritized family and bringing up children. Whereas I don't think we're quite as good here, but I don't think we're as bad as the US.
Mm-hmm.
A really good friend of mine, he married an American girl, and she, I can't
Scandinavia.
remember, maybe after she gave birth to her first child, she might have been back at work. It might be something like 4 weeks or something.
Yeah.
Something obscene, like to me. It sounds obscene to me.
Absolutely.
And the child's in daycare.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, how society is set up now, and then what that is doing. Because you mentioned your mum's, clearly, that's a huge trauma. I mean, that's hopefully the sort of trauma that most of us aren't experiencing. But are there similarities in terms of what that's doing to the child?
Oh, absolutely.
I just realized I was doomed from the start. There was no saving me, no nothing. Because I remember whenever there would be a question towards my parents, like school or something, if everything is all right at home, every time my mother would speak, because my father, of course, he would never attend these kind of meetings. She would say, of course, everything is right, everything is all right, everything is good. We are like the best family. It's all about status for her, always. So in case I would have been diagnosed with anything, it would have meant that they did something wrong, that my mother did something wrong, that my parents did something wrong, which of course would be absolutely unheard of, right? So there wasn't even a chance for me. I was doomed from the get-go with this family I got. There was not a chance, dude. Because getting diagnosed with anything in this regard, or people understanding of what's going on at home, would mean that they did wrong. That something did not meet the status expectation. And therefore I have to suffer it. Doomed from the start. 0%, 0. It's just denial. 100% denial by them. And still is like this. And now we're here. Amazing. That's so awesome. Realizing this is like a punch in the gut right now. There was no way I could do anything. Get anywhere. Being where I am right now is already not being in jail and not having succumbed to drugs. More and more, I'm so proud of myself. Because I've been through hell myself. I've been there myself, dude. And I battled everything myself. I don't have a single friend who I can tell these things. Now I'm telling this to YouTube, but I'm not telling you everything. It's like I'm talking to a mirror, trying to understand myself, just saying the superficial stuff. Of course, it's actually the whole story. It's just that I can't go into the details, you know. It would be way too graphic, way too disgusting. And even though this can be count as talking bad about other people, in brackets my parents, I would be talking really bad about them. Really, really bad. Just doomed.
Absolutely. So the United States, which to hear their politicians is the best and most glorious country in the world, which itself, by the way, is interesting. Like if you met a person, if your neighbor was always telling you how great he was and how he's the best and everyone wants to be like him, what would you think of him?
Yeah.
You think he's got a grandiose personality disorder and he's compensating for his real sense of deficiency. Well, that's the United States. And they have a lot to compensate for. And what you say about childcare is absolutely true, is that they have a barbaric childcare system, a barbaric maternity leave system, where women, and often poor women on welfare, have to go back to work after a few weeks of giving birth. Now, if you look at human evolution, or look at an ape culture, the ape mothers hold their babies for months. There's no separation. The child actually develops through being held by the mother. And human societies, until very recently, were organized around children being around the parents really all their lives, certainly throughout childhood and adolescence. There was just no separation. What we do in our culture, more in the States than elsewhere, but increasingly elsewhere as well, we separate children from their parents. In other words, we're depriving them from the natural conditions for healthy development. Now, there was a study last year or 2 years ago comparing the crying of British, German, Canadian, and Danish children. Lo and behold, Danish kids cried much less than these others. What was the difference? The parents were around much more, and the parents were much more likely to pick up the kids when they were crying. That's what made the difference. Now, that crying child is an anxious child. When the child is crying, it's not just a benign thing. The child is crying because they're stressed. When they're stressed, their brains are suffused by stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol. Adrenaline and cortisol interfere with your physiology, interfere with healthy brain development. So just the fact of holding a child, which was historically and prehistorically the standard, is an essential aspect of child rearing, which modern societies have denied. And as a matter of fact, I don't know what it's like in England, but in North America, we actually advise parents not to pick up their kids. When they're crying at night, we tell them not to pick them up. We sleep train the kid by not picking them up. In other words, denying the child's needs for connection.
And what's that doing to the child, do you think?
Well, it does a number of things. One is to give the child the message that his emotions don't matter. And children take everything personally. It's not true that babies don't have emotions. And it's not true that babies are tabula rasa, where you can write anything you want. Babies have certain defined emotional needs. And when they get the message that they're not important, that's the message they're going to imbibe unconsciously, non-verbally. And you can see that behavior in the adults. You know, the person who comes into your office and says, Doc, I'm sorry to bother you. I'm sure you have many people much more important than me, but I have this little problem. You know what kind of childhood they had.
Yeah.
Number one. So it gives
that would be me going into the doctor.
Okay.
Or in just various aspects of my life and the people pleaser, always doing, always, no problem. The amount of times I think just on a social thing, you'd be like, oh, where do you want to go, guys? Yeah, no worries, wherever. You end up somewhere you just don't want to be in. You're in a restaurant, you hate the food in, but hey, it's cool, guys, no problem. And it's, sorry, I don't mean to trivialize what you're saying.
You're not trivializing it. What you're actually illustrating, you're telling me exactly what kind of infancy you had.
Yeah.
And physiologically, what does it do? The baby's crying, and again, these stress hormones. Now, one of the things that Aboriginal peoples don't do is let their babies cry. When I say it's not that they forbid them to cry, they pick them up. They don't even put them down, to tell you the truth. But should they cry, they pick them up immediately. We, in our society, we actually advise people to let the babies cry. When a baby's crying, it's because they're stressed. When they're stressed, again, their brains are suffused by stress hormones. That interferes with healthy brain development.
You used to work in palliative care.
Yeah.
And I think you're familiar with the book by Bronnie Ware, The Palliative Care Nurse, The Five Regrets of the Dying.
Yeah.
What I thought would be interesting today for our fourth conversation on my podcast together is to maybe go through each of those 5 regrets, because I'd love to know from your perspective what each of these regrets says about where we are, who we are, what things are important to us.
Yeah.
And so the first of those 5 regrets is, I wish I had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me.
Yeah. And so let's keep in mind that, like when I used to work in palliative care, which I did for 7 years, and this nurse who wrote the book, she's Australian, and she wrote the book about 12 years ago now. They weren't talking about people dying at old age. They were mostly, it's about people dying before their time. And so the regrets that they had as their terminal illness, usually malignancy or perhaps chronic autoimmune disease, brought them to the end of their physical existence. What did they regret? And the top one was, I wish I had the courage to live my own life rather than the one that people expected of me. I would reframe that because there's a deep truth in it. And as you know, and perhaps we've talked about, from my point of view, very often the people that do develop chronic illness are people that have suppressed their own true selves for the sake of being accepted to others. And that self-suppression has deep physiological consequences on the immune system, on the nervous system, on the heart, and so on. So that self-suppression is also a physiological self-annihilation in some ways. But when she talks about courage, that's a self-judgment. They're saying to themselves, I wish I'd had the courage, as if it was a question of cowardice. It isn't. It's a question of programming. Like you and I are both parents, we know this. No infant is born suppressing themselves. No infant enters the first day on this earth trying to please anybody. They're just being purely themselves, expressing their joy when it's there, expressing their upset, their distress when that's dominant, but they're purely themselves. So that what she calls courage, or what these people call courage of being myself, is actually a trauma imprint that for some reason they learned early in life, that to be themselves is to court rejection by their environment. So it's not a lack of courage. You can't talk about a 1-year-old lacking courage or a 2-year-old. It's simply an adaptation. Now, later on, they say courage, but really, that courage or the lack of it is a shorthand for something happened to me that I gave up my true self for the sake of being accepted. And that cost me, first of all, it cost them in terms of physical illness, but also cost them in terms of self-respect and dignity. It's a major one.
Yeah. Are you living a life at the moment that's true to yourself?
I am now. I sense that I am. I believe that I am. That doesn't mean every second I do, but on the whole I do, and it feels really good. And I know you and I had dinner last night, and you were telling me that you're finding yourself far more self-expressed and comfortable with who you are than you used to. So that's the good news, people, is that this is a process that can continue for a lifetime.
Yeah.
But I really see that people who suppress themselves really suffer.
Yeah. So that first regret, I wish I had the courage to live a life true to myself. I'm really glad you picked out the word courage, because that word also stands out to me.
Yeah.
It's very interesting to use that word.
Yeah. Well, it's a self-judgment, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
I could have done better. I should have had the courage, is
That's
what
right.
that kind of says.
Yeah.
It's interesting, Gabor, you said when you turned 80, or as a consequence of you turning 80, you realize that, 13 years ago you gave it your medical practice.
Yeah.
Will you be alive in 13 years? That's very striking.
Yeah.
Are you afraid of death?
In principle, I'm not, but I don't really know till I have to face it. I won't know how afraid I am until it confronts me. You know, at this point, I feel healthy and I get to do what I want to do, and I have vigor and I have interests and excitement and love and likes and dislikes, and I'm quite alive. You know, what happens when I have to confront the actuality of it? I have no idea how I'm going to respond. So, it's sometimes I get fear around it. I mean, I don't want to give this up. I don't want to give up this life. But other times I say, well, if I do, I've lived and it's been good and there's not much to regret, you know. So yes and no, but I won't really know until I'm up against it.
How much time do we have left, guys? What do you
You've
think?
spoken publicly before about your journeys with plant medicine.
Yeah.
Does that change anything for you, I guess, or has that changed anything in terms of how you may view what happens at the end of human life? Because many people will say for them it does change how they perceive themselves, how they perceive death, how they perceive what this experience of life actually really is.
Well, specifically, as you're probably aware, they've done studies on end-of-life anxiety with psilocybin, so-called magic mushrooms. And people report spiritual experiences.
Yeah.
And people report a significant abatement of anxiety they had on dying. These are people who are terminally ill. And nothing that the medical profession could offer to reverse the course of their fatal illness. But they had much less anxiety about dying as a result of those spiritual experiences that were induced by taking the mushroom.
Yeah.
For me,
taking mushrooms or LSD was
in that sense when I think of some of my psychedelic experiences, and if in retrospect I allow myself to
life-changing
sink into them, I can say in that state I would not be afraid of death.
Positively.
I'd say that there's a larger reality than the...
Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying this video and you want to learn more, then do check out my free special guide, which contains the 6 crucial steps you need to take in your life to not only build healthy habits, but also to make them stick. If you want to get hold of this free guide, all you have to do is click on the link in the description box below.
Persistence or cessation of this particular lung represents, you know. I would say that if I project myself back into those experiences, again, how I will face it when it happens or when it becomes inevitable, I don't know.
Yeah. Society's view, or this society's view of people getting older, 80 seems to be the age where we often expect people to be doing less, you know, being less mobile, less vital. Not everyone, of course, but many. You seem to be someone who has this
people stand up for you,
love of life, this vigor, this message you want to share. You seem to be traveling all over the globe at, you know, pretty regular intervals. You've come into London for 4 days. You're going to help me do some teaching with doctors tomorrow, which is incredible. But a lot of 80-year-olds are not doing that. Right? And the longevity space within medicine has really exploded over the last few years. People love talking about longevity, right? And I think we're missing something in our discussions about longevity. Well, I think there's a couple of things.
But what do you think we're missing?
I think it depends what you mean by longevity, first of all, right? So, yes, some people want to know, how can I not necessarily live longer, but be independent, mobile, vital as long as I live? So health span versus lifespan. And I get that. But there's a lot of talk these days about extending lifespan, living to 150 and beyond, and all kinds of crazy stuff, right? And I don't want to be I don't want to stand in the way of human progress at all. One of my fears is that in pursuit of living longer, are we missing something about the beauty and the essence of what life really is? Life is finite.
I don't like the way he goes about this question at all. It implies a general idea of prolonging somebody's life being a bad thing because it is unnatural. Therefore, everything in terms of medical research, technology, every milestone that we got is unnatural. We would have been dead by 30, 40 years old. Already, everybody. People didn't get older than that, for sure, a few hundred years ago. So I think his question is a little out of place. It is so debatable. So many people are gonna say, no, it's natural, bigger than anything kind of deal. But I don't like it. But let's see where he goes with this.
The fact that it's finite is what makes it so beautiful.
Yeah.
If we
and it's
could
still gonna
live
be
to
finite.
200,
Even if you live 200,
would we
it's
have
gonna be
even
finite
more of
then.
these regrets because we'd keep taking life for granted?
You know what?
But hopefully
you're
not,
talking my
because you're gonna
language
be
because,
smart enough.
to tell the truth, to coin a phrase, all this stuff about longevity bores me to death. You know, I just don't care. You know, what really matters is what does this moment bring us, or what can we bring to this moment? You know, let the future take care of itself. You know, like Jesus says, take no thought for tomorrow. You know,
Yeah.
and I really think that this longevity movement is a sign of deep social anxiety, and especially you get these rich people in California with their cryo technology of freezing the body, hoping that 100 years from now they'll be able to unfrozen and there'll be treatments for the, you know, it bores me. You know, what really matters is, for me, is what makes life meaningful and active and engaged in the present moment. And it's interesting.
You're gonna live to 200 and you're gonna have up to 200 present moments. That's how I see it. I'm pro. Live to 200. Not because I'm afraid of death. Just because we can. Because why not? There is no moral. Why would you involve moral beliefs in there?
In English, we talk about growing older. Now, that's a very telling phrase.
Just do what you want because you can.
In significant ways, when we get older, we shrink.
If it's fun,
you know, like our bodies.
You're not hurting anybody.
Our muscles are no longer as, you know, supple and strong as they used to be. So what does it mean to grow older? We could just say, like you said earlier, get older, which is just a chronological progression. Or growing older implies that this growth is actually possible. So in what sense can we actually grow? And
that would be cool, no?
We can actually grow into the present moment and growing in our
you're growing,
appreciation for life, and what matters, and knowing what doesn't
learning
matter,
is so
and
fun.
growing in
so
wisdom.
Much fun.
Indigenous cultures,
some days
they
I
don't
wake
talk about
up
elderly. They talk about
I'm
elders.
like, oh my god, today I'm gonna learn about this and that. It's gonna be so amazing. I can see myself doing that forever.
Natural reverence for age that senior cultures would respect, and modern society kind of dismisses.
Lately, there wasn't.
Now, do I wish that my hair was blacker and more curly the way it used to be? Yeah, I do. You know, and it wasn't gray and my hair wasn't thinning at the top, and I sure I wish that. But at the same time, I would not want to be as unconscious as I was when my hair was blacker and curlier, you know?
Yeah, this is such an interesting point. I've spoken to several menopause experts on this show over the past years. And I remember when doing some research on one of the conversations, I came across research showing that in cultures where women are revered as they get older, their wisdom is respected, they're seen as really important parts of the community.
Right.
Those cultures report less menopausal symptoms.
Isn't that interesting?
Just so I'm not misinterpreted, I want to be really clear.
What are menopausal
I'm not saying that means that all menopausal symptoms would go away if that was the case. I just find it interesting that when the cultural view of growing old is different, we perceive ourselves as having
wisdom should always be revered,
a different symptom profile, if I can put it like that.
And the degree of...
But don't misunderstand me. There is some people, every fool is gonna grow old. Just because somebody is old, you don't have to listen to them. Every idiot is gonna grow old.
The of suffering is different, so that maybe they have symptoms or maybe they have certain features, but the suffering is not experienced the same way.
Please expand on that, because I think some people will go, what do you mean? If you're either getting symptoms or you're not getting symptoms, explain what you mean by perception of, you know, the suffering, essentially.
Well, I was talking to somebody else about this today. So as you and I know, in Western medicine, we kind of medicalize everything. And so we talk about premenstrual syndrome. Now, which PMS is a syndrome. It's a medical entity. What is it really? Is that under the impact of hormonal changes, women get more sensitized. So they might have more physical pain and more upset, but we could see that as pathological, Or we could actually say that it's a time of truth-telling, that the hormones do sensitize them to things that are not functioning in their lives, which the rest of the time they're acculturated to acquiesce with and to put up with.
Yeah.
But the menstrual ferment in their bodies makes it less tolerable. So instead of seeing it as a pathology, we could see it as a time of insight. And what if they actually listen to their bodies and listen to what their body's saying no to, that the rest of them they kind of suppress? Then that could be seen as a time of wisdom, rather than a time of suffering. So the
hormone fluctuation is making them crazy, literally crazy, because that is what
happens. But it doesn't have to be experienced as suffering. It could be experienced as a time of truth-telling. And actually, a lot of women have told me that. Once they become aware of that, their relationship to menstruation is totally different. And I think that's what you're saying about menopause as well.
Yeah. This kind of speaks to the second regret, which is, I wish I hadn't worked so hard.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, I agree that for many women, and I can think of so many patients like this, then their hormonal symptoms were actually showing them that the way you're currently living is not in harmony with your body.
Exactly.
Now, of course, sometimes people struggle to make change. It's hard to make change. Maybe their life is mega stressful, and at that moment, they can't change it for whatever reason. And I empathize with that. I understand.
Yeah.
But for some people who are able to, sometimes it's one of the best things that has happened to them.
Yeah. Now, this thing of I wish I hadn't worked so hard, that's an interesting one, because I wish I hadn't worked so hard. And what do I mean by that? Like speaking for myself, and I don't know if this is true for you, but I became a physician for some really good reasons. One of them was I genuinely want to help suffering humanity. And I thought medicine is a perfect
man, I should have become
to which I could help people. That's
a therapist or medic.
I also
something to help people.
Chose a profession where I was fairly confident of making a decent living, so I could support a life for myself and my family.
It's not about money.
But those reasons don't make you work
this is
too
what
hard.
I would value.
They make you work
nowadays
hard,
most.
But they don't make you work too hard. What makes you work too hard, and that's what these people are saying, is you're driven by something that you're not even aware of. And what I wasn't aware of when I went to medical school and when I was a physician for decades is how driven I was to justify my existence in the world and to prove how that I was important and worthwhile and so on. And that had to do with the loss of that confidence owing to early childhood trauma. And so it's not a question. Nobody says, I wish I hadn't worked hard to achieve something in life. You have to work hard. They're saying, I wish I hadn't worked too hard. And that too part, the TOO part, comes from being driven by unconscious needs to validate your existence, where why should any human being have to validate their existence? You know? And so that's what they're saying. And when you're driven to work too hard, you actually ignore what matters. And what matters is what you were telling me last night about how much it matters for you to spend time with your family. So every summer, you take a bunch of weeks away from your podcast and you just spend time enjoying your kids and your wife and your family. And I didn't do that. For me, it was very hard to even take holidays. I always felt I had to keep working. If somebody was pregnant, oh my God, what if I would miss their delivery? Like the baby couldn't enter the world without me, you know? So that drivenness is what makes people work too hard. And so not a matter of working hard, it's a matter of working too hard. And where does that come from? Again, that comes from childhood trauma.
A lot of doctors, and I have several friends like this, they don't take their full allowance of annual leave. Sounds like you may have been similar.
I had that tendency, yeah.
Yeah, and often people will say, and I have a friend who says this, but my patients need me.
No, they don't need them. They need medical help.
Yeah. But I think we have to ask ourselves, and this is very, very common in medicine, actually. I'm sure it's common in other professions as well.
Yeah.
It's interesting when you don't take your full allowance of annual leave that your contract entitles you to. It's often paid time off, right? It's part of your job.
Yeah.
When you're not taking it, of course, there can be reasons for that. There can be reasonable reasons. There can be work reasons. But if you're not, I think it may be worth reflecting on some of those underlying, those real drivers of that.
Well, it occurs to me that what your friend is actually saying is not that my patients need me, but I need my patients to feel okay. And when I'm not working to help them, I don't know who I am and I don't feel comfortable with myself. So I need them. Now that means get you to a therapist and deal with it. And not only that, even your capacity to help your patients over time will be eroded.
Totally.
By the way you're stressing yourself and you're not taking care of yourself. And physicians are notoriously programmed to ignore themselves. And there was a very interesting study that I mentioned in the book, The Myth of Normal. They looked at the fraying of the chromosomes of people. And, when we were born with certain structures called telomeres, and telomeres are DNA structures at the end of our chromosomes, and their fraying and their shortening is a mark of aging and of stress. And they looked at the telomeres of medical residents compared to other people their age. They age faster, they fray faster. Yeah. And so physicians are
stress,
driven,
they say,
to actually
you age faster, right?
Not spare themselves and to literally consume themselves in the work. No, in the long term, that may make you a very popular and very successful doctor, but in the long term, it's going to be at the expense of your marriage and of your children and of your own mental and physical health.
For me, if I look at that situation and I
early, like
reflect on society and culture,
so
what I see these days is a very
bunch of stuff. I think it helped.
It's very me-focused culture where community has been gradually eroded out.
Yeah.
And therefore, if we think about a human being needs to feel that they're of value to other people. We need that. In our tribes, 50,000 years ago, we would have felt of value because we would have a role and other people would see that role. They would benefit from it and we would benefit from the things they were doing, whether it's someone's hunting, someone's gathering, someone's putting the fire on, whatever it might be. In this me-focused culture where it's all me, and what are my needs and what do I need to do and how can I better myself, I feel that we often don't feel of value to others. We don't feel important. And so it makes sense that in that culture, you might overwork. You might keep pushing yourself because if you're not working and feeling important,
you don't need anybody for anything anymore.
Then actually, you may not have that sensation in any other aspects of your life.
It's not really that it has
if you weren't given the
belief, but it's something that you can underline.
If in early childhood you're given the sense that you're valued, just because you existed, your parents welcome you and validate you and value you and celebrate you just because you are, then you don't have to keep proving it afterwards. But if you don't get that sense, then you have to be important.
Yeah.
So that sense of needing to be important has to come from missing out on being valued for who you are or being only valued for your achievements. You're valued. Like, look,
I think that's what I got.
My parents bless their souls, but they
try to get value from,
and so
from external validation,
A lot of my persona was caught up in being smart and proving my value that way. Well, it's good to be intelligent, but your value doesn't depend on or shouldn't depend on any one quality.
It goes hand in hand with my
cute or cuddly or handsome.
What I am, anyways. Like I'm an alpha,
sports or smart in school, or any of that. Your value is intrinsic, innate, inherent.
So it felt
you're a
good
human being. In
but
society,
also just natural.
As you say, it tends to value people for what they do, and so that can become very, very addictive.
As like a leader.
But again, going back to your friend who says, my patients need me, and you think about it, and I'm not accusing them of anything, but they're not realizing just how egotistical that statement is as if it depended on them. Their patients need good medical care, but they don't need him or her or them specifically, which means that they should be able to take care of themselves as long as they make sure that when they're not there, their patients are receiving the care that they need. So it's not about us. And I used to think it was always about me. If I'm not there for the delivery of this particular woman's baby, oh my God, like as if it all depended on me.
There's probably a control issue there as well, isn't there? That I know how I would do it.
Exactly.
So I need to be there because I know how I would manage this birth and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Which is an inability.
Absolutely. But also, I think he takes away a little bit from the bond that he's building with his patients, which is absolute reality. Because in their eyes, he is their doctor, and vice versa, they are his patients. I see what he wants to say, absolutely. But on the same token, man, as if you can take away your hands and say, "Oh, it's not my responsibility," but you are involved with it involuntarily. Somehow it is. Am I wrong for saying that? In so many situations in life, it's such that when you are dealing with people, you become their responsibility and the other way around. It is involuntarily. The moment you raise your hands and say, "I don't have anything to do with it," it's a show of not being interested. In many cultures or circles, you would be seen as an asshole, right? Especially in children. You can draw parallels to where people would, man, where do I go with this? My brain makes connections with people of not texting back within 5 seconds, being called an asshole. Because of the fact that your availability in their mind has to be like immediate, instant. Which sure, that is not that is not to be mandatory, for anything to function. You have your own stuff going on, who knows what's happening at your end. But there is somehow a disconnection, Let's see where they go with this now.
Let's see to let go.
Exactly.
Someone else can probably do this as well.
Yeah, or if they can't do it as well, so
but
be
there
it.
is this emotional attachment. It's an emotional.
As I was walking to the studio
It's
this
so
morning,
rough.
thinking about our conversation, the word impressive kept coming up for me. And I've been reflecting on the word impressive because, again, I think culturally we think it's a good thing to impress others. Okay, that bit of work you did is impressive. But actually, if you really unpick impressive, or certainly if I do it, it implies to me, and maybe this is my own bias because this is what I have done for much of my life.
Yeah.
I've changed who I am in order to impress others.
Yeah.
I didn't feel I impressed others by being myself.
Yeah.
I impressed them by changing.
Yeah.
So what comes up for you when you hear the word impressive? Have we got it wrong? Has it been taken to mean something it's not? Like, how do you see the word impressive?
Well, impressive, first of all, has to do with what? It has to do with our impact on other people, how others see us. So if I can just be myself and express my own truth and not drive myself into activities that are not good for me and people are impressed, well, that's great. But if my intention is to impress other people, if I need for me to make a certain impression in somebody else's mind, then where am I living? Then I'm living in their minds rather than in myself. So the question is, where do I want to live? Here or in your mind? And our society is so addicted to people being impressive in the minds of others. That means that we live in the minds of others more than we live in ourselves. So if you can be yourself, and if I find that impressive, that's great. But you're not doing it to impress me. No. You're just doing it because you're expressing who you are. If I'm impressed, great. If I'm not impressed,
you can take the bad out.
That doesn't take anything away from you. But to the degree that we depend on impressing others, we're robbing ourselves.
It is
so
true.
That's why I see that word.
We're quite isolated.
And I can
now.
see where
many
we
of us
can be
have moved away
detrimental.
from where we grew up. We don't have friends. We don't have a family network around us. And often two parents are working.
Yep.
So you've got this really stressful situation where everyone's trying to do the best that they can. They're trying to, make enough money to feed themselves, to house themselves. They're also trying to spend enough time with their children. Yet they have no support. So there's a huge amount of pressure then that goes on to the kids, but also on the parents.
Yes.
And I think I saw you talk last night at the Tabernacle in London. It was an amazing talk. And you mentioned a little bit about hunter-gatherer societies and how for the bulk of human evolution, we have lived and raised our children a certain way. Yeah. I wonder if you could expand on that.
Well, again, human beings, some version of human beings have been on the earth for millions of years. There have been hominids for millions of years. There have been human species for hundreds of thousands of years, and our own particular species probably for about 100,000 years. Homo sapiens, which is the latest and the only current human species that's extant. For all of that prehistory, until about 9,000 years ago, virtually all human beings lived in small hunter-gatherer bands. This is our evolution. This is how we became human beings. So to think that, now you might liken modern society to a zoo, where you take an animal from a natural habitat and you put them in a completely artificial, restricted situation, and you expect him to stay as normal as he was out there in the wild. Essentially, that's what's happened to human beings, in that in a very short space of time, in a blink of an eye, from the perspective of evolution, we've gone from the hunter-gatherer, small band, communal, attachment-based group to a society which is alienated, disconnected, and that disconnection is accelerating at a tremendous rate throughout the world. Urbanization, it's taking people out of their villages and into the big cities where they're alone. Here in Britain, there was quite a deliberate assault on community under the Thatcher regime, with the destruction of neighborhoods and communities and so on. And that trend has continued. So what we're having is societies that are less and less natural to the actual makeup of human beings from the evolutionary perspective. And which means that children are being brought up under increasingly artificial and disconnected circumstances. And, you know, Johan Hari, who's written a book recently on depression called Lost Connections, is pointing exactly at what's happening in modern society. So that these lost connections characterize the modern world. And as they do, you're getting the spread of autoimmune disease into countries that never used to have it before.
Yeah.
So we think autoimmune disease is one of these, or addictions for that matter. So if you look at the rate of addiction now in countries like China and India, it's going up exponentially precisely because of the, and it's not a question of idealizing the old way of life.
No.
I mean, we can't go back. And of course, there's all kinds of benefits to progress and industrialization. Trouble is that as we progress, we forget the benefits of, we forget what we've lost. So instead of combining progress, we're trying to hold on to what was best about some of the old ways. We just throw everything out. And
not only that, there is ego. And ego is the worst. Especially, look, I don't want to talk bad about how women try to be on par with men in workspace and trying to earn the same money and stuff. Go for it. I'm all up for you, you know. All power to you. But there is ego that says that they have to be working in construction places, in physical jobs, you know, where they would just physically not be suited for. Where do you put a man and you know he's going to be better off doing the job? But you have ego involved in this. And this is just how do you say, like one of many areas where you would see that. He's talking about like this artificial kind of zoo that we are creating for ourselves, right? The problem is, when I say ego, it's not that I'm specifically talking about ego. It is just that we are cursed with just being able to think. And this thinking leads us to such things as having an ego, an overblown ego, a fake ego, fake honor, values that do make sense, but for the wrong reason. Yeah, let's see.
And we think we can reinvent ourselves. And as we do, we're making ourselves sick.
Yeah, you're right. And I think it's a really great point to sort of bring up. We're not saying we need to go back to hunter-gatherer tribes.
We can't.
Not only should we not, we can't. And there are so many great benefits of the modern world. And as you say,
too many
industrialization,
great
I guess
benefits.
it's how do we learn from the past? How do we learn from our evolutionary heritage? And what can we implement from that within the constraints
we must
of the modern
not forget.
world? Certainly,
He's
that's
so
how
right.
I see it. And you mentioned Johan Hari's new book, and you know, I write a huge quarter of my book on stress is about this. Is about relationships and our lack of connection these days. You know, on one level, we're being told anyway that we're more connected than we've ever been before, and certainly in a digital sense that may be the case. But you know, when we talk about real human, meaningful connection, what I see around me with the public, but what I also see in my practice as a doctor, is I don't think we've ever been this disconnected and lonely. And
well, we're more wired, but we're less connected, is how I would put it. Because genuine connection happens between people, not between pieces of technology. So as you and I are talking to each other, there's a real interaction.
Yeah.
When you speak, I'm looking at you.
Think about what happened in COVID. That must have been like the worst.
Or shake my head in disagreement.
The worst shit ever.
But the communication is
happening
taking place on different levels.
In the new age,
That's a
right?
connection. If
So many lives destroyed.
Online, it'd be a whole different ball game, and I'd have no idea actually who I'm talking to. They'd just be exchanging words. So we're wired together.
Apply any conspiracy you want.
Disconnected in this world because people are isolated modules sending out messages via the Ethernet or the internet. When it comes to addictions, it's that disconnection again that leaves us so alone. So we're traumatized in the first place. We are then develop behaviors that soothe our pain, but which actually keeps us more isolated from other people because we're ashamed of ourselves and we hide it and we furtively seek out our addictive pleasures.
And you have the availability to deal with it isolated.
That isolation further our pain, and that pain further drives our addiction. So we live in a society that actually generates addiction in many of its members.
Dude, everything has a dark side to it.
I did a post on my social media channels, I think just yesterday actually, about friendship. And I was saying that, look, seeing your friends in real life, so not over the internet, in real life is a necessity for human health, not a luxury. And I know myself, I'm neglecting some of the friendships closest to me over the last few years because I've been busy with my career and my family. And so, and you sort of see on social media what your friends are doing. So you feel less of a need to actually see them in real life. And I was really surprised with how much that post on social media resonated with people. Yeah. So many people started interacting and saying, yeah, you know what, I've not seen my friends in months. Yes, I've maybe had a bit of a text conversation with them, but I'm not seeing them in real life. And this was me trying to sort of challenge everyone to say, hey, look, get a date in the diary now. Even if it's in 2 months' time, with one of your friends, email them, call them, text them, whatever, but put a date in the diary where you're going to see your friends in real life. And it's crazy, isn't it, that we need to say these things. I mean, these things have always been there in human culture, yet we're now having to talk about them and remind us what has just been our norm for so many millions of years.
Because it's so fast, it's happening too fast. We are not meant for this.
We use the same language as we would in real life. So on Facebook, people have friends. But these friends that we have, these are people we don't know. We have nothing necessarily in common with, except maybe certain cultural ideas or interests. And so these friendships,
these superficial friends, I hope he's gonna go into. I can have online friends that are real friends, that are more of a friend than I have ever I met in person. That is possible, right? I hope he's gonna mention this.
They're pseudo friendships, and we actually substitute the one for the other.
This artificial Facebook, friends, how much friends like number? Who the fuck?
But
nobody ever
substitute for genuine
see
contact.
This as a
but
real
it's not
friend,
that they like each other. They don't even know each other. You don't know somebody until you hung out with them.
And who cares about how many friends you have on what?
And we substitute the language of connection for genuine friendship.
If you're not making business,
and then we wonder why we're so
doesn't matter,
and why we're so dissatisfied,
and why we are seeking pleasure or seeking to numb that discomfort with the choices we're making, whether it is heroin, cocaine, or shopping and sugar.
Children that don't know you better.
Because I guess a lot of people listen to my podcast are trying to make lifestyle change, and a lot of them feel inspired to do so by what they hear. But some of them, I know, are struggling.
Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying this video and want to dive deeper into the topic of nutrition, I have created a free special guide which contains the 5 most important changes I think we all need to make when it comes to our diet. If you want to get hold of this free guide, all you have to do is click on the link in the description box below.
Well, I'm very interested in language, and even the phrase lifestyle change. It's not lifestyle changes people need to make, it's life changes people need to make.
Yeah.
You can change the style, but style is a rather superficial thing. It's a style of clothing, it's the life changes that people need, and we need to help people see the life changes that are required, not the lifestyle changes they need to require. It's the fundamental life that's being lived that needs to change, not the external behaviors. And lifestyle largely refers to behaviors, but not necessarily a transformation within. And really, to deal with addiction, it's not a question of dealing with the lifestyle, it's a question of dealing with the life. And it's a question
There's
of really
so much
life, that this is
good
my
that
life,
comes from this
and
lifestyle.
I'm the one who needs to be
it's just a matter of how you use it.
And here are the reasons why the wound, or the trauma is another word for wound, actually. So the wounding that I received as a child has had me behave in certain ways. It's not those behaviors I need to change. I need to heal that wound. I need to change my life. And then the life behavior changes will automatically follow.
Yeah, you really got me thinking about language, actually, because 2 terms that I use very commonly in my work, whether it's hypertension or lifestyle, you've just, in seconds, reframed what those words actually mean. And I wonder where that comes from. You're an immigrant to North America. Where has this fascination with language come from?
Well, I think as an immigrant, you get to see the language a bit more clearly than the people who are actually in it. And you get to see the construction of language. And by the way, in my secret life, I used to be an English teacher. So I did that before I went to medical school. So I've always paid a lot of English language. And language very often unconsciously expresses realities and truths that when you pay attention to it are revealing.
Yeah.
And so words should never, even the word addict. Now, the word addiction actually comes from a Latin phrase for slavery.
Wow.
So
I love Latin.
A slave to the pain.
Well, the original meaning was an addictus. It comes from the word to assign. Now, in the Roman world, when you couldn't pay a debt, you would be assigned as a slave to somebody until you worked off the debt. So you'd be an addictus. Somebody was assigned to somebody. So that's the origin of the word. So it implies slavery. So if we actually understand that addict refers or originates in the word for slavery, we realize that it's not a choice. Because who would ever choose to be a slave? So I think language is absolutely revelatory if you understand the sources and meanings of words.
Yeah, very much so.
I wish I was better with my language. Like Jordan Peters. Gabor also is very impressive.
you know, I went out for dinner with my friends.
Like if you listen to Jordan Peters,
about it, which was you
I wish I could talk like him. Man.
If there is anyone in here who feels they have some form of addiction without childhood trauma, and you're happy to talk about it, please raise your hand. And you know, at the end, you actually found someone who, you know, quite confidently put their hand up and was, you know, pretty nonchalant that they had a happy childhood. And so you started inquiring into her childhood. And I remember the tone of her voice initially was very much, you said, you know, you have a happy childhood. Yes, happy childhood. Parents said, yeah, parents absolutely love me. You know, really sort of very vocal about how great her childhood was. And then it wasn't long before it became clear that actually she felt that her parents really loved each other and sometimes she was intruding on them.
That's right.
And I think it was really powerful for the whole audience of 300 to see how, you know, how we all potentially tell ourselves a certain narrative, stories that we continue telling ourselves. And, you know, she obviously maybe is a fan of your work. She's come here, she's come to watch you speak, but hadn't reflected on her own experience. And I wonder, you know, what's going on there?
So what's happened here is that this woman says she had this happy childhood, but within a couple of minutes, and you know, my mentor is not by the addiction, but by the pain. And so I always say that there's pain underneath it. And I said to the audience, it never takes any more than 3 minutes to drill down to where the pain is. You just have to ask the right questions. So this,
and I've got to say, about a minute in, I thought maybe this is the first one who Gabor won't get to.
If you really want to know what's going on with yourself, if you want to know the answer to anything, ask yourself 5 times. 5 times. Maybe it needs more. Just ask yourself why. Why do I feel like this? Because this and this. And then on the because this and this, why is it because this and this? And then if you get the answer to this, ask again why. And then you go on and on and on, and you will realize you're going to come to an answer that you didn't think about, but you always knew. Practice it. Whatever answer you want, anything, it applies to anything. Just ask yourself why. Why is that I want it to be like this? Why is it that I react like this? Why did I do this? Why did I say this? It's so easy. So easy. Practice it, dude. You will see it's a miracle.